They tried to force Jake to repaint the door of his own home, claiming its color disrupted the harmony of the neighborhood. The HOA slapped him with hundreds of dollars in fines, and their arrogant chairwoman, Elizabeth Marks, boldly declared that community rules outweigh personal preferences. Confident in her authority, she never imagined that her own schemes would land her at the center of a courtroom scandal. But Jake knew the truth was on his side, and he had prepared something that would turn her world upside down. The ending to this story was so shocking, it left the entire neighborhood talking. But let's start at the beginning. Jake Brown had always taken pride in his home. For him, it wasn't just a house. It was a testament to years of hard work. A sanctuary he had built for his family. After retiring from decades of service as a police officer, Jake and his wife Sarah decided it was finally time to settle down in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where they could enjoy peace and tranquility. Their new home felt perfect. A neatly trimmed lawn. Freshly painted walls. And a spacious yard with a wooden swing that creaks softly in the wind. But despite its charm, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. A red door, Jake said one evening as they sipped coffee on the porch. You know what they say, it's a symbol of luck and happiness. It feels like the final touch we need to make this place truly ours. Sarah smiled warmly, her eyes lighting up at the thought. She loved Jake's enthusiasm, and the idea of a red door seemed perfect to her too. Within days, the transformation was complete. The front door now gleamed with a bold, vibrant red. It was stunning, standing out in the best possible way. Jake felt proud every time he looked at it, as if the door now reflected the joy and comfort he and Sarah had worked so hard to create. Neighbors began to notice the change almost immediately. Some would pass by and smile, offering compliments like, "That door really makes your house pop." But others seemed less enthusiastic, their glances lingering just a bit too long. Jake didn't mind. He wasn't one to worry about what others thought. This was his home, and the red door was a personal touch that meant something special to him and Sarah. Their contentment, however, was soon interrupted. One morning, as Jake went to check the mail, he noticed an envelope with the unmistakable logo of the Homeowners Association. The formal font and crisp stationery already made his stomach sink. He opened it, skimming through the carefully worded notice. It stated that the red door violated the neighborhood's aesthetic harmony, and demanded that it be repainted a neutral color within 14 days. Jake's jaw tightened as he reread the letter, disbelief turning into irritation. Aesthetic harmony, he muttered under his breath. Are they seriously upset about a door? This has got to be a joke. He walked inside and handed the letter to Sarah, who read it with growing concern. They can't actually make us do this, can they? She asked, her voice tinged with unease. Jake shrugged. I don't see how. This is our home, and last time I checked, we're free to paint our door any color we want. But Jake's natural sense of justice wouldn't let him leave it at that. Let's look at their rules, he said, pulling out the HOA documents they had received when they moved in. Sitting at the kitchen table, he carefully combed through the thick stack of papers. Hours passed as Jake scrutinized every clause, determined to find out whether the HOA's demands had any legal basis. Finally, he leaned back in his chair with a triumphant grin. Here it is, he said, pointing to a section of the bylaws. There's nothing in here about door colors. They have no authority to enforce this. Sarah let out a small sigh of relief, but the tension in her expression remained. Are you sure this won't cause problems, Jake? I just don't want them to make life difficult for us. Jake reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. They're the ones causing the problem, Sarah. And I'm not about to let them push us around. If they think I'll roll over and let them dictate how we live in our own home, they've got another thing coming. That evening, Jake stood in front of the red door, his arms crossed as he studied it. What had started as a simple aesthetic choice now felt like a statement. A line in the sand. He wasn't just defending the color of a door. He was standing up for his rights as a homeowner. To him, the bright red door now symbolized not just happiness and luck, but resilience. This is our home, he thought, determination hardening his resolve. And I'll be damned if anyone tries to take that away from us. 2 weeks after Jake had refused to repaint his red door, another letter from the HOA arrived in his mailbox. This time, it wasn't just a notice, it was a fine. The letter coldly stated that Jake owed $500 for violating HOA regulations, and warned that additional fines would accumulate monthly if he didn't comply. Jake read it twice, disbelief turning into anger. $500 for a door, he muttered, slamming the letter onto the kitchen table. Sarah, noticing his frustration, picked up the letter. "Can they really do this?" she asked. Jake shook his head. "Not legally," he said firmly. "But they're trying to intimidate us into giving in. I'm not paying them a cent." Determined to resolve the matter, Jake called the HOA office and requested a meeting with its chairwoman, Elizabeth Marks, whose signature appeared on all the letters. But the response was dismissive. Elizabeth was too busy to address individual complaints. Jake hung up, fuming. Too busy for the people she's supposed to represent? That's convenient. Unwilling to let it go, Jake started talking to his neighbors, curious if anyone else had faced similar issues. At first, most were hesitant to share. But eventually, one older neighbor, Frank, opened up. "She's been doing this for years," Frank said, referring to Elizabeth. "Issuing fines left and right and funneling the money into her so-called administrative fund. No one knows what it's really for, but it sure isn't going to fix anything around here." Frank's story hit a nerve. Jake realized this wasn't just about his door. It was about a pattern of unfair treatment. The more he listened to his neighbors, the more he uncovered. Elizabeth had a habit of targeting residents who didn't conform to her personal standards, using fines as a tool for control. Gardens, mailboxes, even minor decorations, nothing escaped her scrutiny. That night, Jake sat at his desk, piecing together the stories he'd heard. His red door now felt like a symbol of something bigger, a stand against abuse of power. "If they think I'm just going to back down," he thought, glancing at the vibrant door through the window, "they've picked the wrong fight." Jake sat at his kitchen table, staring at the mounting pile of letters from the HOA. The frustration was palpable, but so was the realization. This wasn't a battle he could fight alone. It was clear that Elizabeth Marks, the chairwoman of the HOA, thrived on intimidation and isolation. Jake needed allies. He needed to show others in the neighborhood that standing up wasn't just possible, it was necessary. The next morning, Jake set out to talk to his neighbors. Armed with a notebook and a determination that had grown stronger with each letter from the HOA, he knocked on doors and shared his story. To his relief, many neighbors were sympathetic. As he pieced together their experiences, a pattern emerged. Others too had been targeted by the HOA for violations, hit with arbitrary fines, and stonewalled when they asked for explanations. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Linda, confided that she'd been fined for planting flowers that were deemed inconsistent with the community aesthetic. Another, a young father named Ben, revealed he'd been charged hundreds of dollars for having a basketball hoop in his driveway. A hoop his kids loved and used every day. "These aren't just fines," Jake said during a small gathering of neighbors on his back patio later that week. "They're a way to control us. To keep us quiet. But if we work together, we can push back." The group nodded in agreement. Their initial hesitation giving way to a shared sense of purpose. For many, it was the first time they felt empowered to stand up to the HOA's overreach. Together, they decided to dig deeper. With Jake leading the charge, the group requested access to the HOA's financial records. Under pressure from the growing discontent in the neighborhood, Elizabeth reluctantly provided the documents. What they found was worse than they had expected. The records were riddled with suspicious expenses. Lavish dinners, out-of-town trips, and vague administrative fees that seemed to have no connection to the community's upkeep. Jake's frustration grew as he pored over the numbers. "This isn't mismanagement," he said, his voice firm. "This is exploitation. She's using our money for her personal gain." The group agreed it was time to take action. But Jake knew they couldn't rely on public opinion alone. They needed legal guidance. He scheduled a meeting with a local attorney, a straightforward, no-nonsense woman named Rachel, who specialized in homeowner disputes. Sitting across from her in her cozy office, Jake laid out everything: the fines, the bylaws, the financial irregularities. Rachel listened carefully, occasionally nodding as she reviewed the documents. When she finally spoke, her words were both reassuring and energizing. Legally, they can't enforce penalties for rules that aren't explicitly written in the bylaws, she explained. Your red door, that's not their call to make. And these financial records? If even half of what you're saying is true, you've got a solid case against them. Jake felt a weight lift off his shoulders. So, what's the next step? He asked. Rachel smiled. First, we build a strong case. Gather as much evidence as you can. Documents. Testimonies. Anything that shows a pattern of misuse or overreach. Once we have enough, we file a formal complaint. If they push back, we take it to court. That evening, Jake returned home feeling more determined than ever. The red door stood out in the fading light, a constant reminder of why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about everyone in the neighborhood who had been silenced or made to feel powerless. Jake knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. But he also knew that together, they could uncover the truth and hold Elizabeth Marks accountable. The day of the court hearing arrived. Jake walked into the courtroom with his head held high. Beside him, Rachel, his no-nonsense attorney, carried a thick folder of evidence. The room was stark but imposing, with rows of wooden benches and a raised platform where the judge sat. Jake could feel the weight of the moment as he glanced toward the other side of the room, where Elizabeth Marks sat with her own legal representative. Her posture was confident, almost smug, as if she were already celebrating a victory. As proceedings began, Elizabeth's attorney wasted no time painting Jake as a defiant homeowner who had blatantly disregarded community rules. Mr. Brown's decision to paint his door red was a clear violation of the HOA's guidelines, the attorney declared. Elizabeth, seated nearby, nodded in agreement, her expression cold and self-assured. Jake's jaw tightened. But Rachel gave him a reassuring glance before standing to address the court. Your Honor, my client is a law-abiding homeowner who has done nothing wrong. The HOA's claims are not only baseless, but also directly contradict their own bylaws. With a steady hand, she placed a copy of the HOA's regulations on the judge's bench. As you'll see, there's no mention, none whatsoever, of restrictions on door colors. The judge, a stern but fair-looking man, adjusted his glasses and flipped through the document. Jake could see his brow furrow as he read. For the first time, Elizabeth's confidence seemed to falter. Her attorney attempted to interject, but the judge raised a hand. I'll hear your arguments in a moment, he said, his tone firm. Rachel wasn't finished. She stepped back to her table and pulled out another stack of papers. Additionally, Your Honor, we have evidence that this case is not about maintaining community standards, but rather about personal gain. She handed the documents to the judge, explaining how Elizabeth had funneled HOA funds into questionable expenditures, including lavish trips and expensive dinners, all under the guise of administrative costs. A hush fell over the courtroom as Rachel spoke, her words cutting through the air like a blade. Jake watched as the judge's expression shifted from curiosity to outright displeasure. Turning to Elizabeth, he asked, Ms. Marks, can you explain these expenses? Elizabeth fidgeted in her seat, her earlier composure now replaced with visible unease. They were necessary for the HOA's operations, she stammered. But the explanation lacked conviction. Jake couldn't help but feel a surge of vindication as the tide began to turn. Rachel pressed on, pointing out inconsistencies in Elizabeth's claims and presenting testimonies from neighbors who had suffered under her arbitrary fines. By the time Rachel finished, even Elizabeth's attorney seemed unsure of how to respond. After a brief recess, the judge returned with his decision. His tone was measured but stern as he addressed the room. It is clear that the HOA's actions in this case were not only unjustified, but also constituted an abuse of authority. The fines imposed on Mr. Brown are null and void. And the HOA is ordered to reimburse him with interest. Jake exhaled deeply, relief washing over him. But the judge wasn't done. Furthermore, this court finds sufficient cause to mandate a full audit of the HOA's finances. Ms. Marks, as the chairwoman, you will be held accountable for any further irregularities uncovered during this process. Elizabeth's face turned pale. She stared down at the table in front of her. The judge concluded by advising her to step down from her position immediately to allow for a transparent investigation. It was a decisive blow. One that left no room for misinterpretation. As Jake walked out of the courtroom with Rachel by his side, he was met by several of his neighbors who had come to show their support. They clapped him on the back and thanked him for standing up not just for himself, but for everyone in the community. Jake smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment and unity that made the months of struggle worth it. That evening, as he sat on his porch with Sarah, the red door glowing warmly in the setting sun, Jake finally felt at peace. The fight had been tough. But justice had prevailed. And that door, bold and vibrant, now stood as a symbol. Not just of their home, but of resilience, and the power of standing up for what's right. The aftermath of the trial was nothing short of transformative for Jake and his community. Word spread quickly about his victory. And soon, neighbors who had once felt isolated by the HOA's oppressive rules began to see Jake as a symbol of resilience. People stopped him on his morning walks, offering handshakes and heartfelt thanks. "You stood up for all of us, Jake," one neighbor said, tears glistening in her eyes. "We were too scared to fight, but you gave hope." Jake, ever humble, brushed off the praise with a modest smile. "I just did what anyone should do when something's not right," he replied. Though deep down, he felt a growing sense of pride. Not for himself, but for the way the neighborhood had started to come together. The division and fear Elizabeth Marks had cultivated were slowly being replaced by a newfound sense of unity. Soon, more neighbors began examining their own experiences with the HOA. Stories of arbitrary fines and unexplained fees came pouring out. Inspired by Jake, many residents filed formal complaints, refusing to let unfair practices go unchallenged. The pressure forced the HOA to hold an emergency meeting, where Elizabeth Marks officially stepped down as chairwoman. Her departure was met with a collective sigh of relief. And the community elected a new leader, someone committed to fairness and transparency. The new chairperson wasted no time implementing changes. The HOA bylaws were updated to include clear, resident-approved guidelines, ensuring that no one else would face penalties for minor or non-existent infractions. Financial records were made fully transparent, with every dollar accounted for. The days of hidden administrative funds were over. Jake's red door remained untouched, standing proudly at the front of his home like a banner of victory. It became a neighborhood icon, a symbol of standing up against injustice and refusing to back down. Parents would point it out to their children as they passed by, sharing Jake's story as a lesson in courage and determination. "That door," they would say, "is more than just a color. It's a reminder that we all have the power to make things right." For Jake, the victory was deeply personal. Sitting on his porch one evening with Sarah, he looked at the door, glowing in the soft light of the setting sun. "It's funny," he said, smiling. "All of this started because of a little paint." Sarah nodded, her hand resting gently on his. "But it's what that paint stood for that mattered," she replied. "You reminded everyone that they don't have to accept things just because someone in power says so." Jake reflected on the journey. The frustration, the fear, the moments of doubt, and realized how much he had learned. This wasn't just a victory over Elizabeth Marks, or the HOA's corruption. It was proof that ordinary people could make a difference, even against systems designed to silence them. It was a lesson in the importance of standing firm when something feels wrong, no matter how daunting the challenge. As the neighborhood began to heal and rebuild trust, Jake felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had fought not just for himself, but for a better, fairer community. And every time he passed that red door, he was reminded of what it represented. Not just for him, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless in the face of injustice.